December 26, 1944. Late afternoon. The 101st Airborne Division has been surrounded in Bastogne for 7 days. They're low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, and fighting off German attacks from all directions. Their acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously told the Germans, "nuts," when they demanded surrender, but the paratroopers know time is running out. Then, at 1650 hours, a Sherman tank crashes through the tree line south of town. It's Cobra King from Patton's 4th Armored Division, the lead element of 3rd Army's relief force. The tank commander makes contact with forward positions of the 326th Engineers. The siege is broken. Word spreads through the frozen foxholes. Patton made it. But what the Screaming Eagles said when their rescuers arrived surprised everyone. They didn't celebrate being saved. They told Patton's tankers they never needed rescuing in the first place. This is the story of 7 days that forged a legend. The relief operation military theorists said was impossible, and what the most stubborn soldiers in the American Army really thought about being rescued. On December 18, 1944, the 101st Airborne Division rolled into Bastogne in open-top trucks after a 100-mile journey from reserve positions in France. The division had been resting and refitting after brutal combat in Holland during Operation Market Garden. Most soldiers expected a quiet defensive assignment. Instead, they arrived just 4 hours ahead of German panzer spearheads driving west through the Ardennes forest. What followed would become one of the most celebrated defensive stands in American military history, but it began with chaos and improvisation. The German offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge had started 2 days earlier with devastating surprise. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes, a region Allied commanders had considered unsuitable for major operations. The Germans exploited fog and winter weather that grounded Allied air power, achieving breakthrough that threatened to split American and British forces. Adolf Hitler personally planned the operation, gambling everything on one last offensive that might force the Western Allies to negotiate separate peace. Bastogne sat at the center of this maelstrom because geography made it crucial. 7 major roads converged on the small Belgian town, making it the key to mobility through the Ardennes highlands. German forces needed those roads to maintain momentum for their drive toward Antwerp. American forces needed them to move reinforcements and supplies. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. General Troy Middleton, commanding Waite Corps, recognized immediately that Bastogne had to be held regardless of cost. The 101st arrived to find a confusing tactical situation. Elements of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B had been rushed to Bastogne and were fighting delaying actions east of town. Stragglers from shattered units were streaming through Bastogne heading west. German forces were advancing from multiple directions, but nobody knew exactly where German units were or in what strength. McAuliffe, the division's acting commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington when the crisis broke, had to establish defensive perimeter around Bastogne, using whatever forces he could organize. What McAuliffe accomplished over the next 24 hours demonstrated the 101st's exceptional training and leadership. The division established a circular defensive perimeter approximately 16 miles in circumference, anchored on the town, but extending into surrounding countryside. Each of the division's 4 regiments took responsibility for a sector. Combat Command B from 10th Armored provided mobile armored reserve that could respond to German breakthrough attempts. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion rushed to Bastogne to provide anti-tank capability, positioned its weapons to cover likely German approach routes. The defensive position was far from ideal. The perimeter was too large for the forces available to defend it in depth. There were inevitable gaps between units that German forces could potentially exploit. Ammunition stocks were limited. The division had moved so quickly that much of its artillery ammunition remained in dumps far to the rear. Food supplies were adequate for perhaps a week if rationed strictly. Medical supplies were sufficient for routine casualties, but not for sustained combat. Most critically, winter weather conditions were brutal, and many soldiers lacked cold weather gear. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the north. Panzer Lehr Division pressed from the south and east. The 2nd Panzer Division bypassed Bastogne to the north, leaving screening forces to contain the garrison while its main body continued west. For the soldiers of the 101st, the realization that they were surrounded was almost abstract. They had trained to operate behind enemy lines during airborne operations, so encirclement was tactically familiar, even if strategically concerning. The German attacks that followed over the next several days tested the 101st's defensive capabilities severely. The Wehrmacht units attacking Bastogne were experienced formations that had fought on multiple fronts. They possessed armored support and artillery that the lightly equipped airborne division struggled to match. Yet the paratroopers held. They turned back armored attacks using bazookas, tank destroyers, and artillery fire carefully coordinated by forward observers. They defended villages and road junctions with stubborn determination that frustrated German commanders who expected lighter resistance from surrounded forces. The psychological dimension of the siege was as important as the tactical. The 101st's soldiers believed they could hold Bastogne indefinitely if properly supplied. They trusted their officers, particularly McAuliffe, whose calm confidence under pressure reassured soldiers in the frozen foxholes. Most importantly, they took pride in their division's elite status. The Screaming Eagles had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through the hedgerows. They had jumped into Holland during Market Garden. They were not ordinary infantry, they were airborne, and airborne soldiers did not surrender regardless of circumstances. On the morning of December 22, 1944, a peculiar delegation approached American positions south of Bastogne. 4 German soldiers walked under a white flag of truce, carrying a formal surrender ultimatum for the American commander. The timing was calculated. German forces had tightened their grip around Bastogne over the previous 2 days. Weather prevented aerial resupply. American ammunition stocks were dwindling. German intelligence suggested that American morale was cracking under pressure of sustained attacks and winter hardship. The surrender demand was designed to break American will before German forces had to conduct costly final assault. The German officers were blindfolded and escorted to the command post of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, where Major Alvin Jones received them. The surrender ultimatum, written in English, was formal and threatening. It noted that Bastogne was surrounded by strong German armored units and that continued resistance was pointless. The ultimatum stated that if American forces did not surrender by a specified deadline, German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers would reduce Bastogne to rubble. The message concluded by offering honorable treatment as prisoners of war if Americans surrendered immediately, while implying that refusal would result in annihilation. Jones took the ultimatum to McAuliffe's headquarters, where the acting division commander had been catching brief rest. McAuliffe woke to news that Germans were demanding surrender. His initial response, delivered in the groggy moments after waking, was a single word: nuts. As McAuliffe fully awakened and his staff briefed him on the ultimatum's contents, the question became how to formally respond. The German officers were waiting for written reply to carry back to their commander. Some staff officers suggested a formal military rejection. McAuliffe struggled to find appropriate wording until Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, suggested that nuts was actually the perfect response. The written reply that was delivered to the German officers was brief and unprecedented in military communications. It read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The Germans were confused by the response, unsure whether it represented actual rejection or was some American idiom they did not understand. The American officers escorting them back to German lines helpfully explained that nuts meant the same as go to hell, and that if the Germans did not understand that, they could simply continue the attack and find out what it meant the hard way. The nuts response became legendary instantly. Word spread through American positions in Bastogne within hours, boosting morale among soldiers who were cold, hungry, and low on ammunition. The story reached American correspondents embedded with relief forces, and from there spread to newspapers across the United States. McAuliffe's defiance symbolized American determination to resist regardless of circumstances. The response was everything that military communiques usually were not: brief, direct, and filled with personality that reflected the character of the division fighting in Bastogne. But McAuliffe's confidence was not blind optimism or theatrical bravado. He knew things that the German ultimatum suggested they did not. First, weather forecasts predicted clearing skies within days, which would allow Allied air power to provide support and conduct aerial resupply. Second, McAuliffe had been in communication with 8th Corps Commander General Middleton, who had informed him that General Patton's Third Army was already racing north to relieve Bastogne. McAuliffe calculated that if his forces could hold for several more days, relief would arrive before German forces could mount successful final assault. The German response to McAuliffe's rejection was immediate and harsh. German artillery intensified bombardment of Bastogne, focusing on the town center where American headquarters and medical facilities were concentrated. Luftwaffe bombers conducted nighttime raids that destroyed buildings and created casualties among both military personnel and Belgian civilians. German ground attacks increased in intensity, probing the defensive perimeter for weak points that could be exploited for breakthrough into the town center. Yet the psychological impact of the nuts response worked in American favor rather than German. The defiant rejection signaled to German commanders that American forces in Bastogne were not demoralized and would not surrender without costly fight. This complicated German operational planning. If Bastogne had to be reduced by force, it would consume time and resources that German offensive timetable could not afford. The delays that McAuliffe's defense created were as valuable as the tactical position his division held. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared as forecasters had predicted. The clearing skies brought immediate relief to the besieged garrison. American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Bastogne, attacking German positions and providing close air support that compensated for dwindling American artillery ammunition. C-47 transport aircraft began dropping supplies by parachute, delivering ammunition, medical supplies, and food that allowed the 101st to continue fighting. The aerial resupply was not perfect. Some supplies landed in German-held territory, but it was sufficient to keep the defense viable. On December 19, 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun, France, to address the German breakthrough in the Ardennes. The atmosphere was grim. German forces had achieved surprise and were driving toward the Meuse River. American units were scattered and in some cases routed. The situation required immediate counteraction, but the scale of the crisis exceeded anything Allied commanders had faced since Normandy. Eisenhower needed someone who could move quickly and hit hard. He turned to George Patton. Patton entered the conference with characteristic confidence that bordered on arrogance. While other commanders discussed the crisis in somber tones, Patton appeared almost eager. Eisenhower tried to maintain optimism, telling assembled commanders to view the German offensive as an opportunity rather than disaster. Patton embraced that perspective genuinely. He recognized that German forces had overextended themselves and that aggressive counterattack into their flanks could turn breakthrough into catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. The critical question was timing. Eisenhower outlined the situation. American forces at Bastogne were surrounded and needed relief. How quickly could Patton attack north to break through German lines and relieve the garrison? Most commanders in the room thought any attack would require weeks to prepare. Moving an entire army 90 degrees from its current axis of attack, across winter terrain while maintaining supply lines and coordination. Military theorists considered such operations to require extensive planning and preparation. Patton's answer stunned everyone present. He stated he could attack in 3 days with 3 divisions. The claim seemed impossible. Patton's Third Army was heavily engaged along the Saar River, more than 100 miles south of Bastogne. Disengaging from current operations, reorienting forces northward, establishing new supply routes, and coordinating attacks across completely different terrain. Accomplishing all this in 72 hours defied conventional military planning. Several commanders thought Patton was being reckless, or was not taking the operational challenges seriously. But Patton had been preparing for exactly this contingency. He had read intelligence reports throughout November and early December suggesting German buildup opposite the Ardennes sector. While he had not predicted the exact timing or scale of the German offensive, he had recognized the possibility of major German attacks somewhere along the front. Patton had ordered his staff to develop contingency plans for rapidly reorienting Third Army's axis of advance. When the crisis broke, detailed operational orders already existed and simply needed to be executed. Leaving the Verdun conference, Patton telephoned his headquarters and issued a 2-word code phrase: play ball. This activated pre-planned orders that set the entire Third Army in motion. 3rd Corps under Major General John Milliken would spearhead the attack toward Bastogne with the 4th Armored Division leading the advance. 2nd Corps under Major General Manton Eddy would attack on the right flank to protect the 3rd Corps' advance and retake the town of Echternach. Within hours, divisions were disengaging from current positions. Supply columns were reorienting, and combat units were moving north toward jump-off positions. The movement that followed was one of the most impressive logistical accomplishments of the war. In just over 2 days, Patton moved more than 130,000 troops and over 60,000 vehicles, an average distance of 75 miles. The 4th Armored Division traveled 151 miles from Lorraine to Belgium in 19 hours, a rate of advance that would have been impressive for an unopposed administrative move, much less a tactical redeployment during active operations. The coordination required to move that many units simultaneously without creating massive traffic jams or logistical breakdowns was extraordinary. On December 22nd, exactly 3 days after the Verdun Conference, as Patton had promised, 3 Corps attacked northward toward Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey led the advance, supported by the 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride and the 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul. The attack caught German forces by surprise. Wehrmacht commanders had anticipated continued American defensive operations, but did not expect aggressive counteroffensive so quickly after their own breakthrough. The advance toward Bastogne was not the clean armored thrust that Patton preferred. Winter weather limited visibility and mobility. German forces, while surprised by the timing of the American counterattack, defended stubbornly from prepared positions. The narrow roads through the Ardennes restricted maneuver, forcing American armor to attack frontally rather than exploiting flanks. Progress was measured in miles per day rather than the dozens of miles per day that characterized Third Army's summer advances across France. Yet Patton maintained relentless pressure. When units encountered strong resistance, he ordered them to find alternate routes rather than become fixed in costly frontal assaults. When progress slowed, he personally visited forward headquarters to demand renewed attacks. His famous statement that weather was perfect for killing Germans reflected his determination to maintain offensive momentum, regardless of conditions that other commanders might consider prohibitive. The 4th Armored Division absorbed casualties and equipment losses, but continued advancing toward Bastogne through sheer determination and aggressive leadership. By December 26th, after 4 days of continuous combat, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division finally broke through German encirclement. The tank Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, crashed through the tree line south of Bastogne and made contact with forward positions of the 101st Airborne's 326th Engineers at approximately 1650 hours. The siege was broken. Patton had accomplished exactly what he promised in exactly the time frame he specified. When Cobra King broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, the tank's crew expected to find desperate soldiers grateful for rescue. What they actually encountered surprised Patton's tankers and created a legend that the 101st Airborne cherishes to this day. The paratroopers of the Screaming Eagles made clear they had not been rescued because they never needed rescuing in the first place. They had been temporarily surrounded, certainly, but they had held their positions and defeated every German attack. Third Army's arrival simply restored ground communications and supply routes that had been temporarily interrupted. This attitude was not mere bravado or false pride. The 101st's assessment of the situation was militarily accurate. The division had successfully defended Bastogne's perimeter against sustained German attacks for 7 days. Ammunition stocks, while low, remained adequate for continued operations. Aerial resupply on December 23rd had delivered critical supplies that extended the division's defensive capability. Most importantly, German attacks had failed to breach American defensive positions. The Wehrmacht units assaulting Bastogne had suffered substantial casualties without achieving breakthrough that would have forced American surrender or withdrawal. The paratroopers' attitude reflected the 101st Airborne's elite self-image and fierce pride in their accomplishments. They were not ordinary infantry who held defensive positions until relieved. They were airborne soldiers trained to operate behind enemy lines for extended periods. Being surrounded was not a crisis. It was standard operating procedure for airborne operations. The comparison to their D-Day mission was obvious. They had jumped into Normandy behind German lines, held positions against counterattacks, and linked up with relief forces. Bastogne was operationally similar, except they had arrived by truck rather than parachute. When Patton visited Bastogne on December 30th to award decorations and congratulate the garrison, the interaction between Third Army's commander and the 101st's soldiers revealed this psychological dynamic. Patton praised the division's defense in characteristically dramatic terms, calling it one of the most brilliant operations of the war. but many paratroopers bristled at any suggestion they had been rescued. They emphasized that Third Army's arrival was appreciated for restoring supply lines, but was not necessary for continued defense. Some soldiers later claimed they were prepared to hold Bastogne indefinitely, regardless of whether relief arrived. This attitude created tensions between Third Army units and the 101st that persisted throughout the remainder of the Bastogne operations. Third Army soldiers who had fought through difficult winter conditions to break the encirclement felt their sacrifice was not properly appreciated by the paratroopers they had come to relieve. The 4th Armored Division particularly resented the implication that their relief operation had been unnecessary. They had lost substantial numbers of killed and wounded fighting through German defenses, and they believed their accomplishment deserved recognition rather than dismissal. The debate over whether the 101st needed rescuing became part of American military culture and persists to present day. Third Army veterans and historians sympathetic to Patton emphasized the deteriorating tactical situation in Bastogne before relief arrived. Ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. German attacks were intensifying. Without Third Army's breakthrough, these analysts argued, the 101st would have eventually been forced to surrender or attempt breakout that would have resulted in substantial casualties and likely failure. The 101st's position, articulated by veterans and division historians, was that tactical difficulties did not constitute strategic failure. Every defensive operation involves resource constraints and enemy pressure. The relevant question was whether the defense could have continued successfully, and the 101st maintained it could have. Aerial resupply, while imperfect, was sufficient to sustain operations. German attacks, while sustained, were not breaking through defensive perimeter. The division's casualties from December 19th through January 6th, 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, 516 missing, were substantial but not catastrophic for a division-sized force. The truth lies somewhere between these positions. The 101st successfully defended Bastogne against determined German attacks under extremely difficult conditions. This defensive success was genuine military accomplishment that deserved recognition, but the siege was not indefinitely sustainable. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food were finite resources that aerial resupply could supplement but not fully replace. German forces were not giving up. They continued attacking Bastogne through late December and into January. Third Army's relief operation ended the siege phase and created conditions for transition to offensive operations that would eventually eliminate the German salient. What cannot be disputed is the 101st Airborne's performance during the siege. The division held critical terrain against numerically superior German forces for 7 days, under winter conditions with limited supplies. This defense frustrated German operational plans and created delays that allowed Allied forces to respond to the breakthrough. McAuliffe's leadership and the paratroopers' determination demonstrated American fighting capability at its best. Whether they technically needed rescuing became irrelevant. What mattered was that they held Bastogne when it needed to be held. The siege of Bastogne concluded officially on December 27th, when ground communications were fully restored and wounded could be evacuated to rear area hospitals. But fighting in the region continued through January, as American forces pushed German units back toward their start lines. For the 101st Airborne, the battle's conclusion marked the beginning of a legend that would define the division's identity for decades. They adopted the nickname, the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, acknowledging the casualties they suffered while emphasizing they had never surrendered or retreated despite being surrounded. The relationship between Patton and the 101st following the relief remained complex. Patton genuinely admired the division's defensive performance and said so publicly on multiple occasions. On January 14, 1945, he personally presented Brigadier General McAuliffe with the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the siege. In that ceremony, Patton praised the 101st's stand in terms that would have been generous from any commander. But Patton also believed and stated that Third Army had rescued the 101st, a characterization the paratroopers rejected then and continue to reject. The Battle of the Bulge as a whole represented the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces during World War II. Total American casualties exceeded 76,000, including approximately 19,000 killed. The 101st Airborne's losses at Bastogne were substantial. 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, 516 missing during the period from December 19th through January 6th. but represented a fraction of total American casualties during the German offensive. Yet Bastogne became the most celebrated American action of the battle, partly because of the siege narrative and partly because of McAuliffe's nuts response that captured American imagination. For Third Army, the relief of Bastogne validated Patton's operational methods and confirmed his reputation as America's most aggressive combat commander. The 90-degree pivot of an entire army in 72 hours, followed by sustained attack through difficult winter terrain against determined German resistance, represented military accomplishment that few commanders could have matched. Eisenhower recognized this, and Patton's star rose higher in American military hierarchy, despite earlier controversies that had nearly ended his career. The debate over whether the 101st needed rescuing obscures more important lessons about the Battle of the Bulge and the Bastogne operation specifically. The German offensive failed not because of any single factor, but because American forces at multiple levels responded effectively to surprise attack. Units that were overrun or bypassed continued fighting, disrupting German timetables and consuming resources. Commanders like McAuliffe at Bastogne and others at St. Vith refused to surrender despite being surrounded. Higher commanders like Eisenhower and Patton made rapid decisions that shifted forces to threatened sectors. This flexibility and determination at all levels defeated German operational plans. The Bastogne siege also demonstrated the importance of combined arms warfare and inter-service cooperation. The 101st's ground defense succeeded partly because of aerial resupply and close air support provided when weather cleared. Patton's relief operation depended on air superiority that prevented Luftwaffe from interdicting Third Army's advance. Artillery support from both besieged garrison and relief force created integrated fire plan that defeated German attacks. No single branch or service won at Bastogne. Victory resulted from effective integration of all combat capabilities. For the 101st Airborne Division, Bastogne became the defining experience that shaped institutional culture for generations. Veterans of the siege formed the core leadership of the division during the Korean War, Vietnam War, and subsequent conflicts. The lessons learned about defensive operations, small unit leadership, and soldier initiative during crisis became foundational principles taught to new paratroopers. The attitude that airborne soldiers do not surrender, do not retreat, and do not need rescuing became central to division identity. What the 101st Airborne said when Patton broke through to Bastogne, their insistence they never needed rescuing, represented more than pride or stubbornness. It reflected their understanding that they had successfully accomplished their mission despite extraordinary challenges. They had been ordered to hold Bastogne, and they had held it. Patton's relief was welcome and appreciated, but it did not constitute rescue of forces that were about to fail. This distinction mattered to the paratroopers then, and continues to matter to the 101st Airborne today. The legacy of Bastogne is shared between the 101st Airborne Division that defended the town and Third Army that relieved it. Both accomplished remarkable military feats under extremely difficult conditions. The paratroopers' stubborn defense and Patton's aggressive relief operation represented American military capability at its best. Whether the 101st technically needed rescuing became less important than what both forces accomplished together, defeating Germany's last major offensive in the West and hastening the end of the war in Europe. The battered bastards of Bastogne and Patton's Third Army each earned their place in American military history, and their combined achievement at Bastogne ensured neither would ever be forgotten.